Hello, everybody. Welcome to Economics Monday on the IBM TV network. Today we have a very great lineup for this day's show. We're going to discuss a lot of the issues relating to the economy. First one I want to bring in is the president of the Swiss Impact Investment Association, actually out of Zug, Switzerland. Let's bring in the president of the association, Ben Banerjee. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Thank you for inviting me.
Good to have you here. Later on today, we will be visited by the former Comptroller General of the United States, the Honorable David M. Walker. He's going to be coming in about 30 minutes from now. But let's add more to the panel. This gentleman is actually a tax management partner of one of the fourth or fifth largest CPA firms in the state of California, Holt, Hulse, Carlin, and Van Tryke. Let's bring in our CPA expert, Blake Christian. Blake, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Nick.
Okay. Yes, and later on, the Honorable David M. Walker will be joining us. I talked to him earlier yesterday. He was on vacation the last couple of weeks, so he wasn't there, but now he's going to be here today. From down under, we bring in our multi-billion-dollar hedge fund manager out of Sydney, Australia, still trapped down there. Let's welcome Shaquille Latimer. Shaquille, welcome to the show, Economics Monday. We're going to have a full house, and David M. Walker will be here later on today. So we'll be meeting the former Comptroller General of the United States, just to let you know. And then from Canada, we bring in the person who heads modern investing out of Canada. Let's welcome Sasha Starr. Sasha, do свидания.
Good morning.
Do свидания. Завтрашка, whatever you say in Russian. Not really familiar with that. And then for the final panelist today, we have the person who's actually a former associate dean of the University of South Dakota School of Law, now sits on the board at the South Dakota Trust Company. Let's bring in Dan Worthington. Dan, welcome to the show.
Hi, everyone.
Okay. Well, today we have a lot of interesting topics, and one of the topics we want to start off with, of course, we dodged a bullet the other day with the debt ceiling in the United States, and I have a different feeling about this debt ceiling, and apparently it's been raised, so now it's not going to be an issue till I think December the 3rd, where it becomes an issue again. So I'm going to start with Ben Banerjee, since you showed up first, about the debt ceiling in the United States, and since you're part of the Swiss Impact Investment Association, do the Swiss and the European Union even follow the debt ceiling? They don't follow, they don't care. I mean, I look at it, and even Jimmy Dimon, who heads Chase Bank, said, we spent $100 million in a defensive position in the event the debt ceiling actually the U.S. defaults on its obligations. What are your thoughts, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, the whole European Union is watching on it, and everybody else, as far as I know, is watching it, because the issue is, it's a structural issue that U.S. has, and it faces every year, is that your expenses are higher than your income. So of course the debt ceiling has to be increased. But coming to the debt ceiling of now, what is happening, I think, in my personal opinion, the Republicans are playing with fire, because this debt ceiling is to be increased to cover the expenses that their administration caused. And not only that, it's every year is the same story. Whether it's the Republican government or the Democratic government, they always agreed together to raise it. So now the Republicans are playing a game which has become a kind of typical of them, to go back on their own words and break their own words. But that's that's my opinion to start with. Nick, you are on mute, I think.
I was going to bring in Blake, since I know you work in the area of taxation, but we have a very important issue that seems to take place every couple of months. I call it Russian roulette with the economy, which, as we recall in 2008, the market slid 37% and took years to recover. I don't know if you talk about in your CPA partnership meetings, what happens if our dysfunctional government gets not together and they actually default on the U.S. obligations around the world? Do you have any defensive positions? Well, what are your clients going to do if the economy slides 37%, which it did in 2008?
Right. Well, it's definitely a possibility. I don't think it's going to happen, but this has happened over 70 times before, and it's always worked out. We have had government shutdowns before. The problem, has been mentioned, is we spend more than we take in, and so about 22 cents of every dollar the government spends is borrowed. And so we've got this timing difference, and we have to pay bills on effectively a cash basis. We're up to $28 trillion. They increased the debt limit by over 400 billion.
Sorry.
Got some feedback there. But so anyway, the payments would not come out. As you said, we default at a minimum. We predict, or the economists predict, a 25 basis point increase in our borrowing cost. That's $60 billion a month, 700 billion for a year. Again, I don't think that's going to happen, but it definitely could. So, taking some profits off the table in your stock portfolios, probably not a bad idea. We're still pretty strong here despite all this impasse. So,
okay, yeah, Dan Worthington, I know you sit on the board of South Dakota Trust Company, managing lots of funds. Is there a position that you guys take? What happens if the government doesn't get together and they actually default on their obligations? In other words, the Russian roulette, the bullet hits.
Well, I mean, obviously, it creates tremendous concern, as was explained earlier. The last time they reached an impasse, it had a horrible impact on the markets, and that in turn has a horrible impact on the net worth of individuals who have equity positions in the market, and that's never good for clients. So it's always better if the Congress can be responsible, keep its obligations, and meet its debt obligations. The problem is that this Congress and this president have gone batshit crazy with the money, and they're not anywhere near being responsible with the fiscal realities of the United States. I don't know how much longer our friends and allies and our less friendly non-allies will put up with this. Everyone in the world's having problems with that right now, and maybe that's the key. We talk about all these Care Bear programs that are impossible to pay for. We can't even pay for fundamental governmental services in the United States and keeping up our infrastructure. And we want to give away our money to people who are illegal coming across the border and doing a bunch of other things when we can't even care for ourselves. So it's irresponsible financial management based on government policies that are not sustainable in the near future, and certainly not sustainable in the long future, and puts our country at substantial financial, political, and military risk. How about that?
You're muted, Nick. You're muted, Nick.
Muted.
Nick, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Oh, down under, mate. I was going to say, what do they think down under in Australia about the United States playing Russian roulette with our debt ceiling and potentially defaulting on our obligations around the world?
Well, unfortunately, I can't speak for all Australians. Good to see you, Ben. I haven't seen each other for a while. Look, to me, what I would consider to be the real issue with this is the fact that the reason why the debt ceiling is being discussed the way it is right now, and I can't think of another example of this, I'm sure there has been, but I just can't think of one, is that it's not just about raising the debt ceiling. When there was a government shutdown because of debt ceiling issues under Donald Trump and Obama, all that happened was federal employees got furloughed or were having to work and they didn't get paid until they came back. Here, it's if we don't raise the debt ceiling, we can't make the interest payment on the debt that we have. The fact that it's that close is a really sizable issue. When I was first learning finance and economics and things like that, I was always told that US debt is considered to be risk-free. And I always just ask, but why? Why is it risk-free? Why do we consider it that way? Like, we've seen major countries in history default. Why is there this idea that the US never could? And one of the best explanations I ever had was because treasury notes could be used to extinguish debt. So at the end of the day, as money is created from debt, banks can pay taxes and other government fees by handing back currency or handing back treasury notes. And so, okay, fair enough. The other idea is that the government, well, the Fed can theoretically print an unlimited amount of money and inflate the currency in order to actually make payments on the debt. So this is a very interesting situation. We haven't, it's not just a situation where, as Dan Worthington has talked about, irresponsible spending. That's the reason for there being a debt ceiling in the first place that came out, in 1915 or 1917 or whatever it was. That's the reason why, because prior to that, debts were governed by parliamentary procedures in the United States. But the issue is that when you've got rising debts and no apparent way of being able to pay for the debts that you've got, no apparent way to actually not just make the current payments on it, but actually pay the debts off, I think that has a problem. And even under the Bretton Woods system, one of the concerns that you would have is that the Fed and the Treasury would end up creating money and buying it off each other, and it would just spiral. But that's a really significant concern. And I think that some of the things you need to worry about is if the European market, which is the world's largest market combined, because obviously the European Union has so many countries in it, if they get nervous, where do they go? At the moment, European debt is very, very high. Euro dollars, which is the price of American dollars held in banks outside of Europe, the prices on those on euro dollars and other overseas US assets are going to increase. The yield will increase. When that happens, what's America going to do? America doesn't have a lot of options left. So I think that the politicians and the government in America is going to have to address this, and it's immediate. And this raising the debt ceiling, this isn't a proper raise. They've kicked it to December. That's only a couple of months away.
Right.
So this isn't a solution that's going to last very long. Thankfully, Republicans have agreed to allow them to do that, so there's not a default. The last thing I'll just very quickly say, when we talk about defaults, it's not as though the United States will not pay at all, okay? They may not make their payment on time in this scenario, but remember, for a default to become catastrophic, you have to not receive anything back. That's very, very rare. And I would suggest that I shouldn't say it, because maybe the politicians get ideas, if they don't make their payments on time, when they resolve the impasse, the payments will be made to the creditors, because America has to do that. But I'd be very surprised and very disappointed if American politicians, left, right, whatever, allow that to happen.
Okay, now let's hear from Canada. Sasha Starr, up in Canada, also you head up Modern Investing on the IBM TV network on Wednesday. I'm sure you're monitoring this situation upstairs. What are your thoughts about the United States and the potential Russian roulette that goes on every several months that we're going to default on our obligations?
I think only Russians can play Russian roulette. America is well equipped of doing that. If I'm not mistaken, actually the previous Führer of United States he lowered taxes and raised the debt of $8, possibly $9 trillion. So that's where the main problem is. So now the poor Biden is fighting for some $3.5 trillion spread over 10 years, and he'll never get even that. And then yet previous person in the office raised $8-9 trillion. I hope I'm not misrepresenting the facts. Okay, so if that's the case, then I see all this as a noise. It's a political show, because if it's all serious, then the certain people really have to be put in jail as traitors, and they're doing nothing but sabotage of United States. And I think there are remedies available to deal with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So the thing is, we have a response.
Sorry, I just want to make a quick comment. Now, I'm not a partisan. I'm certainly not a partisan on American politics, right? Because domestic political issues are just not my concern. I just want to make a comment, because I've heard this before, that under Donald Trump the debt went up so much. But just remember that under Donald Trump, the economy boomed as well. The issue that political left-leaning parties often have is that they want to spend money on things that are not hard infrastructure. So it's not actually an asset that you can value easily. If you spend the money building a bridge or a road or a stadium or whatever, you are actually able to value that. When you spend the money on social services, it's harder to actually value. Now, Europe has had this issue for a long time. Europe has for a very long time provided high levels of social services. That's what most people in wealthy countries end up demanding from their government. But in a lot of places like Denmark, the Netherlands, they've had to actually roll back some of those programs. Socialism didn't work in Sweden. They tried and they tried and they tried. What they had to come up with in the end, what they had to settle with, is what pretty much every liberal democracy settles on: a mixed system, socialization of public services, and a capitalist economy. Now, even Biden still says that sort of stuff. He still actually talks about that stuff. But the problem is that when he wants to spend $3.5 trillion, it's not clear that that's going to have a direct economic positive effect on the economy. That's not clear. So that's going to have inflationary pressures to the value of the US dollar. And that's why we consider it to be bad for the economy. The other thing that's a problem there is that you cannot solve poverty just by giving theoretically, the bottom 20% of people a whole heap of money. Because all that happens is that prices, without any other government intervention, prices go up because there's more money for the same amount of goods. That's why this is more of a problem than what it was under Donald Trump, because Donald Trump lowering taxes, he also lowered regulations. So the increase in the economy was a buffer to the increase in debt. That's not so clear in this example of what Biden's trying to do.
Well, you talk about European socialism. Let's bring in Ben Banerjee. I believe you're beaming in from Switzerland. Is that background Swiss, or where are you beaming in from?
It's from Switzerland. I just wanted to add, because I agree to what Sasha mentioned more. Keep in mind that the richest countries, or the best economically most successful countries in Europe, including Switzerland, is so-called a very socialist system. So there is no poverty because poor people really get money cash out. And that makes a huge difference economically and socially. So I'm a full stander for what Biden is standing for, or what he's doing. And what Sasha mentioned, that 8 trillion or 9 trillion, that money is gone. But what Biden is proposing is something else. That's 3.5 trillion. And it is, whether it is a hard infrastructure or soft infrastructure, in both cases, it is the infrastructure which Europe already, in many cases, already has. So the whole difference in Europe about rich countries and poor countries, and exactly the countries you mentioned, Shakil, like Netherlands, Sweden, these are really the richest countries of Europe. And these still are the richest countries of Europe. Despite of what you mentioned, they may have problems with the socialist system or giving money to poor people. In Netherlands, you still give money to poor people. And that may really be the cause why Netherlands is still such a rich country. Same with Sweden, same with Switzerland. These are rich countries because when you give money also to the poor people or unemployed people, these people go and do shopping and the money keeps circulating. Instead of what Trump did is he completely gave money to just a very small group of extremely exponentially rich people. And that money did not end up in American or in the middle class or the upper middle class. This money ended up with a very, very small group of people. And that's why it didn't have a very big added value for the United States economy.
Ben, I'm sorry. Let me respond to what you've said, because I sharply disagree with you, and it's not because of the politics of it. It's just the economic reality of it. Okay, not taking money from the rich is not the same as giving the rich money. It's their money to start off with. If you're going to compare the US economy to Europe, almost all countries in the European Union have some sort of consumption tax, whether it be a sales tax or a VAT or something along those lines. Almost every single country in Europe has that. There is no federal consumption tax in the United States. That means that there's no broadness to the tax base. If we talk about Sweden, there are 3 tax bands in Sweden. There's 17 tax bands in the United States. The bottom 50% of the United States income earners pay on a net basis less than 3% of the taxes. That is unsustainable. Having a system of progressive taxes to that degree, there's nothing wrong with there being some level of progression, but having progressive taxes to that degree and stacking it to that point is what makes it such a tenuous position for the United States. If they want to fix their problems and fund social services, it's not just responsibility for the rich to pay for it. Everybody has to contribute to it. The fact is the United States doesn't want to do that because the United States have backed themselves into a corner where any tax breaks are always going to be favoring the rich, and any suggestion that you would tax the poor, how could you tax these downtrodden people? There's a big difference between what America is doing and what Canada does. Canada doesn't have the same level of progressive taxation bans, and that's a country that's just north of America. Okay, the only country that I'm aware of, I'm sure there are others, but the only country I'm aware of that has a tax code that is that dysfunctional is the United States. I can't think of another country where it's that bad. And then you've got state and local taxes on top of it. So
let's hear from America. We've heard from Switzerland, Australia. Blake Christian, I believe you're in the United States of America and you work in the area of taxes. What are your thoughts about this?
I'm voting for Shaquille for president. I understand Ben's point also, but I do want to point out that Switzerland benefited so much from COVID because all the rich bought all of your watches. You can't even buy them anymore in the States. So you should be happy that
I have mine.
the rich got richer. Yes.
All right.
This progressive system is just insanely lopsided now, and I think I've mentioned on here before. I was fortunate to have Art Laffer as one of my graduate school professors, and so I'm a supply side guy, but I also seeing 40 years of CPA practice that the trickle down part of supply side economics doesn't work. When the ultra wealthy get more money, they buy their fourth home or more Swiss watches. Rather, they don't always create jobs with it. But marginally, as you put more money into business owners' hands, they are going to be entrepreneurial about that and create some level of new jobs. But it isn't unlimited. So I am all for, decreased taxes, but it was touched on earlier. Lighter regulation is the crushing part in the United States, and especially red states like California, New York, where the regulation is just stifling on businesses. And you see a very smart guy like Elon Musk,
he's leaving,
leave to go to Texas because they've got virtually no taxes, and although they do have some corporate taxes, and they have very, very light regulation. Right.
Let's hear from another American who's Dan Worthington, who works with the South Dakota Trust Company. I'm not sure how many assets are under South Dakota Trust Company, but apparently there's a lot of them. What are your thoughts about this? The spending 1.5 trillion, 3.5 trillion on the infrastructure bill, Dan?
It's not an infrastructure bill. I mean, that's really the truth of it. And I've heard it spun so many different ways that Peppermint Patty gets on national news every day. And the last thing she says was, well, it doesn't really cost us anything. Well, that's a lie. It's $3.5 trillion. Take $3.5 trillion and divide that up and give it away to the American people rather than, it's ridiculous. Now, you talk about tax increases. American people are already seeing tax increases, tremendous tax increases. The price of gas has gone up well over $1 a gallon at the pump since Biden decided to do anti-energy programs and shut down pipelines and do other things. We're no longer energy independent, which that's punitive to the American people. And we're certainly seeing it at the gas pump. Prices of groceries and other consumable goods is going up. That's a tax on those who are in the lower income bracket. It's a direct tax. It's difficult to sustain the economy with the calculus that the Democrats are playing. The American people, I don't know how dumb and naive the American people are, but certainly not recognizing the fact that the price increases, inflationary forces actually are an effective tax rate and a burden on them because of the poor economic policies of this administration and their political cohorts. And so this is what's creating the problem. Now, I agree that not all the tax cuts for those who are wealthy end up benefiting those who are less fortunate. What would be better is to target small businesses and the engines of employment in the United States to help them be successful and to reduce regulation and to allow them to be able to provide more jobs in an effective way. I mean, some well-intended programs like creating a minimum wage at $15 and other things actually backfire because the truth is the employers have to pay that, and they can't afford to employ as many people if they're paying wages that are higher than they can sustain based on their margins and other things. It's just business. Peppermint Patty would tell you, well, it's what did she say? Corrupt for the corporations to pass on their cost increases to the American people. But my gosh, that's the way it works. If your cost of goods go higher, you have to raise prices. And guess who pays those prices? It's the American people. It's like Shaquille said, it's obvious. Without an increase in production or quantity of goods and quality of goods in the system, you hand out money, what happens is that causes inflation because there are only so many goods in the market, supply and demand. It's basic economics. It's like these people never took any lessons in economics, or if they did, they went to the wrong school. It's just absolutely insane. I already expressed that in a different way.
Right, and they probably didn't take a course in economics. But let's bring in Sasha Starr. We'll hear from Canada. I know you're looking at the market on a daily basis, including probably right now. We'll see you, Mr. Blake, right? Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's hear from Sasha.
I'm a little bit puzzled. Dan, you just mentioned that people cannot afford to pay $15 an hour because the business will suffer and all this stuff. The reality is very different. People are now looking for workers, paying them even up to $20 an hour, or even 22 and a half, and whatever. They just can't find the workers.
You know why?
Well,
You know why?
because people during the last COVID time or so on, they accumulated a little bit of money here and there. And maybe they already left industry where they previously were. Maybe they opened their own businesses, or maybe they went to Las Vegas and got lucky. I really don't know why. But people.
Well, I can tell you why. People would rather sit
yeah.
on their asses than work. I mean, that's really
Exactly.
what it is, right? I mean,
You hit it.
and so that's the
You're
problem.
absolutely
People
right.
need to get back to work in some way or another. I mean, it's important for them to do that in order to keep the economy of the American economy moving forward. I mean, we have 25,000 cargo ships sitting outside on the docks of America that can't be unloaded because people don't want to get out their dead ass and go to work. I mean,
Exactly.
It's really a problem. At the COVID restrictions, well, in fact, the COVID restrictions are another problem because that idiot California governor that should have been impeached. I mean, the whole thing is really ridiculous, and we're shooting ourselves in the foot. It sort of reminds me of like the BYU football team this week, fumbling 3 times. And you create your own losses, and what's happening in this country is we're doing it deliberately because our idiot politicians don't understand economics and are sabotaging the things that need to happen in order for us to get back to work and for people to work and to get the goods flowing that we do have that are offshore sitting in ships that can't be offloaded because there are not enough people to offload it, and there are too many restrictions to keep them from offloading.
And let's bring in the Honorable David M. Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States of America, now a professor at the U.S. Naval Academy. David, like to welcome you back to the show. I guess you're done with your vacation. Good to have you here.
Yes, I am.
And
I am.
we were talking about a couple items, and number one deals with something happening in your neck of the woods in Washington, D.C., the debt ceiling. Now, they decided to increase the debt ceiling to December 3rd, but are we not playing Russian roulette with the world economy with this debt ceiling, potential default. In other words, they actually default. Someday some politician decides not to vote, and all of a sudden we default on our obligations worldwide.
Well, first, Mitch McConnell was taking a lot of criticism from former President Trump and others about the deal that he cut, and I think people don't understand the context. It's important that we not default because of the potential adverse implications that could have on the economy, both domestically and around the world. Secondly, McConnell did two things. One, he gave a temporary extension for about 2 months. And secondly, he agreed to a specified number. What the Democrats wanted was a blank check. They wanted to suspend the debt ceiling, and they wanted to suspend it past the midterm elections, which means that there would have been no constraints whatsoever on whatever spending they wanted to do, whether it's the bills that are pending right now or anything else that they might try to do. So it's basically delayed this. Now, the other thing that people need to understand is there's only two things guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States financially. U.S. accrued interest, it's guaranteed, all right? And Union Civil War pensions, which we've paid. And the irony about the debt ceiling is this money's guaranteed by the Constitution. Nothing else is. Social Security's not, Medicare is not, defense is not, nothing else is guaranteed. Only that, all right? So from a practical standpoint, we're going to pay it. But what we really need to recognize is that we're the only major nation on earth that has a debt ceiling. It hasn't worked. It's a dismal failure. And it needs to be repealed and replaced with a debt to GDP mechanism that has specific targets, triggers, and automatic enforcement mechanisms. And one of the enforcement mechanisms ought to be these people lose their jobs, cannot stand for re-election if they violate it. The problem is there's no consequences for these people. They don't live in the same world that 98% of the other people live in. So those are just a few thoughts, but I don't feel too strongly about it,
Dave, can I just make a couple of comments though? Other countries through parliamentary processes do have the ability to restrain government spending, and a notable example in Australia was that the Liberals, which is our political right-leaning party, actually blocked supply, which is blocking the supply of money to the incumbent government. And quite a big famous thing that happened in Australia was that the opposition leader called on the Governor-General to sack the government, exercising the Queen's powers, which I think even today is something that most Australians, even if they agree that that Prime Minister should have left, didn't like the way that it happened. Supply was blocked by the Senate because of the change in powers, and Europe has a similar kind of thing. I just want to add to this though that when we talk about tax cuts to the rich and these sorts of things, I was having this conversation a little while ago with somebody, and I said, here's the thing, with the idea of progressive taxes, that seems to make some level of sense. But when they sort of suggest that the rich should pay for everything, if you want to tax the top 10 or 20% of the population in order to help the bottom 10 or 20, fair enough. The middle class, if it's a broad tax base, they'll pretty much pay for themselves with a little bit of a subsidy, and that's about it. If you want to compare to Europe, most European countries, they sit somewhere between 30 and 35% of tax revenue to the GDP of the country. The United States sits at 25%, Australia's at 27 or 28. So, there is a shortfall. The question is, how do you bring that up? Now, if the idea is that we're just going to tax the rich only earn 40% of the money in the country. So if you had them pay for all of it and you're at 35%, what are the rich going to end up with? 5% of the GDP? That's where that question about overtaxing the rich and trickle-down economics. If you overtax the rich, they don't have enough money to be able to afford to take the risks. And that's something that people don't really talk about. People talk about they need money to invest in businesses and blah, blah, blah. They need to have the financial resources to take the risks in the first place. I, for example, will not just invest in one thing. I'll invest in multiple things, knowing that statistically speaking, a lot of things that I'll invest in will lose. So if I don't have the financial resources to take on those risks, then I won't take them in the first place. And the other thing is that when you have huge and high levels of income tax, many of the rich don't get rich because of income.
Shaquille, I would like to remind you, you're a student of economics, and as such, you should understand and appreciate the fact that, contrary to what you just said, rich do not take risks. It's a poor people taking risks, trying to get out of their poverty, to start small business, to do this or that. Most of them will fail anyway, as you know. Rich people, they don't take risk. Furthermore, I've learned a great deal, and there is a lot of evidence that America is being infiltrated by Russian propaganda, Russian mafia, the money that are circulating through American banks and so on. And that's why in December, I think the 8th or 9th of December, there will be a new bill that would require not only bankers, but even all the enablers like lawyers and fund managers or so on, to clarify not up to $10,000, to one penny, the money that they're being brought through to American assets, to buy them, to just clear the dirty money. All that will be now required complete due diligence. And guess what? FBR will be part of it. Of doing the due diligence. So that hopefully will make things a little bit cleaner here, because right now I'm afraid that look at this, the factory aluminum production that will be starting in Kentucky. That's where the name Moscow Mitch is came out of. And I think it's not just him, it's most of the politicians in Congress and Senate. They are not doing their best for the United States of America. They're doing that for their parties and themselves personally. And this where the problem is, unfortunately. Thank you.
Well, that's a good question. Dave, since you're in the Tower of Power in Washington, D.C., do you see an influence of foreign governments, foreign money in the big city, the Tower of Power? In other words,
look, there's the influence of money, period. All right. Money talks, BS walks. Okay. And a lot of people with BS in Washington, and there's a lot of money in Washington being passed around. Look, I mean, one of the other comments that was mentioned before, the wealthy pay a lot higher percentage of income taxes, than most people realize. All right. And yet over 50% of Americans, the number one tax they pay is for social insurance taxes, for Social Security and Medicare. All right. In fact, about 40% of Americans pay no income tax at all. I'm talking about individuals, and about 20% get a rebate, primarily because of the earned income tax credit. All right. And we are taxing at a below average level as compared to post World War II, but we're spending at an above average level, and the gap is growing. So there's absolutely no question that we need comprehensive tax reform that will be pro-growth, simpler, fair, more sustainable. All right. We cannot grow our way out of this financial hole. The problem is primarily a spending problem, but not exclusively a spending problem. We're going to have additional revenues. You're not going to get it through growth alone, and you're not going to get it through the wealthy alone. And in fact, one of the biggest BS lines that's being told right now in Washington is that the proposed tax provisions that the administration are pushing will not end up raising taxes on anybody making less than $400,000 a year. Well, that's just flat false, because they're talking about increasing energy taxes, and other things that disproportionately fall upon, less well off. In addition to that, the cruelest tax of all, which is called inflation, is going up again. And now real wages are falling again. And yet we have a situation, which you touched on before, where we have more job openings in America than in the history of the country. And yet, the unemployment rate is going down. Why is the unemployment rate going down? Because people are leaving the workforce. And now they want to end up having legislation that's going to end up paying you if you have kids, whether no matter how much money you make and no matter whether you're working or not.
Yeah. And why is it we have such an aversion, Dave, to fiscal responsibility? In other words, apparently the American public, when it comes to let's be fiscally responsible, they don't want to hear that. They want to hear about how Washington is going to pay for their child, how Washington is going to give them family leave, how Washington's going to give them extra vacation, how Washington's going to give them income.
I actually don't agree. I actually don't agree with that.
Okay.
I actually don't agree with that. I think the problem is the politicians. The politicians want to provide more benefits and keep taxes as low as possible. And they are living for today, and they're not worried about mortgaging tomorrow. They're focused on the next election. Most Americans, once they're given the facts and once they understand the consequences of our current path, want change. So the problem, I believe, is more the politicians. And I think the issue that we're dealing with right now with this legislation in Washington, a lot of people are focusing on the numbers. That's the wrong thing to focus on. Yes, they are shockingly high. What we need to focus on is the fact that we have a battle going on in this country right now between the principles and values under which we were founded and that made us great and the socialist state principles. Let me mention a few and then I'll stop. Limited but effective government, individual liberty and opportunity, personal responsibility and accountability, rule of law, intergenerational equity, stewardship. Those are founding principles, all right? Some of the other ones, the socialist state principles are grow government, increase dependency, don't worry about deficits, raise taxes to plug any problem that you have, take control of education, take control of healthcare. I can keep on going. That's what this battle is about. It is a battle about the soul of America and what kind of America do we want going forward.
I think it's worth saying that, all this sort of cradle to grave stuff was one thing when that was being advocated coming out of the Great Depression. But, yes, politicians are the problem, but let's not underestimate groups like ALEC who managed to just, create all this legislation. When was the last time that a politician actually sat down and wrote the regulation or law themselves? I mean, I still am just besides myself that a particular political party thought it was a good idea just recently to introduce and table onto the floor a bill that literally wasn't written yet. Literally held up some paper that was blank and said, let's vote on it. I mean, talk about taking the piss. And so they, what are you voting on? But the reality is that really, even the ones that are written, who cares what's in there? Because they don't know, they don't read it, they don't write it, their aides write it, lobbyists write it, and groups like ALEC write it. And you know that if you get your legislation handed to you by ALEC, you're going to have some support. And so right, Dan and Nick, you don't have to respond to that. I know I might get myself a little bit of trouble for talking about it.
Well, the thing is, there's another important issue that's taking place, but it's into the future, what David was describing. When it's in the future, they kick can down the road. And that's Social Security, the trust fund, potentially running out of money in the year 2033, which isn't too far from now. Has Congress addressed that issue? I know they want to spend $3.5 trillion. They want to spend money. But wait a minute, there's this Social Security trust fund. It's going to go bankrupt in 2033. Why isn't that on the media? Why isn't that important? Or is that important?
Yeah. Well, first, the latest trustees report, I think, says 2034 for the combined fund, but it's probably going to accelerate again because we're still having adverse effects of COVID, if you will, both on the revenue and the spending side. Even more immediate is Medicare Part A, hospital insurance. The latest report says 2026. And that's only 5 years away, and it's probably going to accelerate too. This has to do with what I said before. People are focused on today that you can have large, known, and growing problems, and they typically do not handle it until it reaches crisis proportions. Keep in mind what happened in 1983. The last time we had Social Security reform was 1983. The reason that we had it was because we were within weeks of the trust fund going to zero. which is the equivalent of the 2034 number, all right, within weeks. And what happens if the trust fund goes to zero? Under the current projections for Social Security, benefits would be cut by 22% across the board. Now, if you're going to tell tens of millions of seniors that their benefits are going to get cut 22% across the board, that dog don't hunt. That's not politically acceptable. But it's just another example of how they wait until the absolute last minute, which is not only imprudent, but you wouldn't have to make as many changes, and you can have a lot more transition time if you did it sooner rather than later.
Right, and shouldn't that issue be front and center even before the infrastructure bill? In other words, this is a serious problem. And the thing is, hey, look, I believe we should fix our infrastructure, but look, if you can't afford to fix your infrastructure, you can't, rather than letting a trust fund like that go broke. Just another plug for those who haven't seen it.
Well,
American 2040 Still a Superpower by the Honorable David M. Walker. If you haven't bought that book, make sure you have. But let's talk about the Social Security Trust Fund.
104, based on the latest financial statement, September 30, 2020. There's $104 trillion in liabilities and unfunded obligations for pensions, healthcare, Social Security, Medicare, etc. $104 trillion. And therefore, I argue, look, you can't have legislation anymore that says we're paying for it. Because if you're paying for it, what about the $104 trillion hole? When are you going to start doing something about the $104 trillion hole? You can't just pay for new expansions of government and call that success, because you've already promised way more than you have resources to pay for. My personal view is we need more investment and less consumption. All right. We need more means testing. We need more work requirements with regard to things that we're doing. Okay. We have very perverse incentives, which exacerbates our problem. But so I'm for the bipartisan infrastructure bill. I'm strongly against the next piece of legislation that would basically increase the size and scope of the federal government, dependency on the federal government, and wouldn't do anything to address that $104 trillion.
Can I just say, Dave, what my fear is actually, it's not actually that the trust will run out. My fear is that they'll allow inflation to go up so high because Social Security benefits are not pegged. It's not pegged to inflation. It's not pegged actually to the cost of living.
Actually, it is.
Okay, I understand.
That's why that doesn't solve the problem. Social Security is pegged to inflation, and in fact, this week we're supposed to get the inflation number, and it's expected to be the highest inflation number in 30 years. And so you can't. The other problem that you have is healthcare is a much bigger problem than Social Security. Medicare and Medicaid are a much bigger problem. Then you add on top of that the Affordable Care Act, et cetera. And healthcare costs not only grow faster than inflation, they go faster than the economy. So you can't grow your way out of these problems, okay? And you can't inflate your way out of these problems.
Well,
you need to make some tough choices.
Even though you can peg it to inflation, you're pegging it to the national average. So some places like New York, you're going to see inflation rates in cost of living terms be substantially higher. The other thing, just to throw another spanner in the works, it doesn't really get talked about very much when we talk about US debt. We only ever talk about federal debt, but the debts from the individual states is absolutely astronomical. I'm just couldn't believe when I looked up the debts for New York and California. And I don't want to pick on the blue states. Some of the debts that we're seeing in some of the red states is just astronomical as well. And so when you look at the United States from an outside perspective, if you didn't know it was America and you were reading these books, you would be way away from that. You wouldn't want to have anything to do with investing in those sorts of places because it looks like bad management.
Well, and the other thing you have to keep in mind when you look at those financial statements, which I do, the biggest and ugliest numbers at the federal, state, and local level are unfunded pensions and retiree health care obligations. They are much bigger than the quote unquote debt, the official debt. And they're indexed. I mean, the government indexes their pensions, okay? And the government healthcare benefits are much more generous than the private sector, all right? So demographics and other factors are really a much more serious problem, frankly, for government programs than overall.
Yeah, it just so happens to be an area I actually work in, which is in the pension area, and study that, David. And you're right. The thing is, there are a lot of states that their pensions, they're way upside down on. Cities like where you're at, and when you were in Connecticut, Bridgeport tried to get rid of their pension liabilities by filing Chapter 9, and so did the city of Ventura in California. So what happens, and part of it is that people don't understand pension liabilities. They don't take classes in it when they're in high school or middle school. So pensions for them are like a word. It doesn't mean anything to them. Yes, Sasha.
Well, from what I heard from all of you, it seems to me that it's about time to put United States under certain administrative powers. I would call it just liquidators, and just to see what's possible to sell and to liquidate and give it to people and just tell them good luck. That's it.
Well, Sasha, the United States has the whole world by the certain parts of their anatomy.
Not anymore.
Because even if you called in the liquidators, there isn't enough to liquidate that's owned by the government.
we might be upside down in our liquidation sale.
We just have Hunter Biden create a bunch of artwork and sell it.
Well, so this is what gets me, David. We're talking about spending $3.5 trillion when our house is on fire, and I don't get that. No one talks about, hey, look at the house look at the Social Security running out in 2033, 2034. Why aren't we taking a look at that? And there's some maneuvers that they can do. Now, I've been a big beneficiary of that. My grandmother, who was unfortunately extremely wealthy, like I said, my uncle was the former, he was actually the attorney general under Nixon and Ford, and we had a lot of bank stocks, so we were doing quite well. Well, she was a millionaire when millionaires were few and far between, and she started receiving Social Security checks. And I go, she's never worked a day in her life, and she starts getting these Social Security checks, basically. And throughout the whole system, it was actuarially unsound. It was a pay-as-you-go, as opposed to build up a reserve, and then pay out of a reserve. And then there's this cap on Social Security. And I know that being a higher income taxpayer, I reach a certain level and I don't pay Social Security taxes anymore. I feel great about it. I tell my employees and they go, what? I said, you didn't know that? No, none of them knew that. These people are like in their 60s and they didn't know that. Anyway.
Well, first, there's no longer a cap on Medicare. There used to be.
Yes, I know that. Right.
There is a cap on Social Security, and the tax on Social Security is a lot higher than Medicare, as you know.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
And there's no question in my mind that just as we did in 1983, that cap needs to be raised significantly. All right.
Right. Or lifted. I mean, you're making millions.
Or eliminated, but it needs to be changed. There's no question about that. All right.
Right.
And one of the problems we have in America is financial illiteracy.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't do enough to teach financial literacy and civic responsibility in high school. And that's one of the reasons it's contributing to our dysfunctionality.
Right.
But maybe they should teach it to politicians.
That's
probably
they came out of high school too, and they obviously didn't get it.
No, exactly. So I'm looking at the debt clock, and I just noticed something that I hadn't actually noticed before. The current US federal spending is just over $7 trillion. Okay. The budget deficit is $3 trillion. That means that the US federal government, just at a federal level, is spending almost twice as much as what it earns. Like, how does that make sense to anybody? Like, in a crisis, you might say, look, we're spending 20%, 30% more, we're going to borrow. You're spending almost double what you earn. And another thing that I actually noticed was, the money supply over the last sort of 20 years or so has gone from 4 trillion to 21. These are huge numbers. The credit derivatives market, $600 trillion as opposed to 92. So we've expanded the money supply massively. And if America does it, so do all the other countries. So it's not just an American problem. But, you know, I would say when we had the credit crisis, that was a banking issue. If we saw a crisis with a major economy, Europe or one of the major European countries like Germany or France, if we saw the issue in the United States or any other major country, potentially China as well, the contagion from that is going to be huge. And, you know, decentralized currencies like Bitcoin can only do so much. You're eroding trust in the banking system as well by wanting everything over $600 to be reported. That's going to make people a lot more concerned. They're going to start looking for alternatives, which is going to shrink rapidly the money supply. These are really significant issues, and there's a lot of risk. I do believe, and I certainly hope and pray that we'll get through it. But, you know, we really do need to have somebody who's got enough charisma to be able to actually win, you know, by a sizable majority in the United States, whether that be a Republican or a Democrat, and we really need to have politicians be responsible.
The last part's going to be very challenging, you know. And David, don't you see that a problem that when you're dealing with the people that are voting, and the thing is they don't have a financial background, and neither do the people that are the politicians, and they're the ones that are guiding the economy, and that's the reason when I looked at this. And Jamie Dimon did the same thing at Chase when he's looking at the politicians getting together, and 48 senators voted to go ahead and default. What happens if all of a sudden there's the tipping point and all of a sudden the politicians go ahead and they vote to default?
To be fair, they didn't vote.
Look,
They
didn't vote to extend either. Yeah.
Well, but they knew that it was going to pass. All right. I mean, you know.
So they voted on political lines, not what they believed in.
Yeah, but let's look at this. Okay. Just suppose they didn't raise the debt limit.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, first, what's the sanction? If you violate it, what's the sanction?
There
Does
isn't.
anybody lose their job? No. All right. That's part of it. Secondly, as I said, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution guarantees U.S. debt and accrued interest. So what my view would be is we're still going to pay U.S. debt. We're still going to pay interest. All right. The question is, what are we not going to pay?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Dave, if the debt ceiling wasn't raised by Congress, does Treasury or the Fed have any ability to independently and unilaterally make payments regardless of the debt ceiling restraint by Congress?
That was a discussion that was going on in the White House and in the Treasury Department. If they didn't raise the debt ceiling, could they invoke the 14th Amendment and still pay debt payments? All right. My view is that, you know, as we know under the Constitution, the Congress is responsible for fiscal policy. And what the debt ceiling is, the debt ceiling just says you can't borrow more, right? It doesn't say you can't pay your debts. And since the 14th Amendment says that those debts are guaranteed by the Constitution of the U.S., I would argue the logical result of that is you can't pay other things. Yeah. You can't pay other spending. You have to pay your debt. And that's when the politicians have a problem, okay? Because what are you going to do? Not pay Social Security, not pay Medicare? You're not going to pay federal employees? What are you not going to pay? And as you pointed out, the gap is so great. I mean, we're not talking about a 10% gap or a 15% gap. We're talking about a huge gap. So that's a practical problem.
And we're at the hour, so we do want to thank our special guest, the Honorable David M. Walker, former Comptroller General of the United States, and our panelists. We will see you all next week on Economics Monday. Thank you.